Uh, Good evening, all. My name is Talha Köse. I am the chair of Political Science and International Relations Department at Ibn Haldun University. So I would like to thank Arts, Culture and Sports at Ibn Haldun University for organizing this important event. So as you know, this is the 10th year of the Arab Spring. It changed its name in different contexts. So Arab uprisings, in some cases it has been mentioned differently. So whatever you call that revolutionary events that changed the political, social and cultural landscape in the Middle East and North Africa region. And we still believe that we are in very early stages of this transformation. So we lived some early revolutions, uprisings. It affected almost all the countries in the region, inspired many people in the region. So it changed the regimes and it changed the political systems in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, and it stimulated some change almost in other countries like Jordan, Morocco. In some cases, the revolutions or spring was suppressed, like in the case of Egypt and Syria, but still the ideas, the movement, the energy that brought these events of Arab Spring are still there. So one of my colleagues, Ibrahim Freyhat, called his book about this event as Unfinished Revolutions. So I still believe that it is the 10th anniversary of these popular protest movements, which ended up in different outcomes in different countries. So we will be evaluating this process. So although according to world history, this is a very short time, and in terms of international relations, 10 years may be a long time, but it gives us enough time to, I think, reflect on those issues. I think the personal reflections are also very important. So our three important speakers today will make some evaluations as well as their personal reflections on these important phenomena. So I think we have very important speakers today. So Hakkı Öcal is one of the most senior journalists in Turkey. He's teaching at, Dr. Hakkı Öcal is teaching at Ibn Haldun University, Media and Communications Department. So he has an experience in Voice of America. He spent lots of time in Washington, D.C., Istanbul. He has been one of the most senior journalists as well as academics in the field of communication. So I think his reflections are important. Our second speaker is Hiba İzzet Rauf. She's an important scholar of political sociology, politics. In addition to his, academic activism, academic studies, he has been intellectually very involved in this process. So fortunately, he's a member of our faculty at Ibn Haldun University. So she's teaching at Political Science Department as well as our Alliance of Civilizations Institute. So, and our third speaker is Lina Shami. So she's a graduate student at Political Science and International Relations Department at Ibn Haldun University. Her experience and background is different. I mean, she is not coming from political science background, but her own experience, life story is very interesting, and she is more engaged with the politics study as both academic as well as more activist side of the story. So we have three very important persons today who will reflect on both the large story of Arab Spring, Arab uprising, and their own connections, personal connections and reflections on this. And you, the audience, definitely have lots of things to say on this issue. So I would be also allowing, after the initial presentations of our speakers, we will also give some space to questions, and we will allow maybe more detailed discussions on this issue. So, with this brief introduction, I will start with Dr. Hakkı Öcal's presentation and reflection on the issue. So, he may be speaking from different perspectives as an academic, as a journalist, as a personal, experience. But I'll leave it to Hakkı Hocam. Whatever you want to take, I think it will be very interesting for us to listen your own reflections.
Thank you very much, Talha Hocam. I'd like to be moderating this program, and I would rather have you as speaker so that we all would benefit from your perspective and your analysis of the political events before and during and after this so-called spring thing, which has anything but spring, and it has some things to do with Arabs, but it is not Arabic in true sense of the word. Whatever it is, I would like to listen to you, to hear your views, your opinions on it. I wish we could have chance for that. I've been visiting many Arab countries as a journalist. In 1967, some of your fathers, even your fathers, were not born then. I visited. I was sent to cover the war between Egypt and Israel and other countries from the Egyptian side, but the point where we were the guests of the Egyptian army, it was occupied next day by the Israeli soldiers, and we were prisoners of war taken to Israel, to Tel Aviv, and we were sent to our homes from there. And my first experience in this true sense of the revolution or event or riot or something happening in an Arab world was very old thing in 1960s. Later, I covered some wars between Egypt and Libya. It was nothing but war. Things like that. I visited Tunis, I visited Morocco and everything. And I saw the poverty there, and I saw, especially during the Russian, the countermeasures of the West to Russian invasion of Afghanistan, was how easy they organized those Mujahideen troops from the poor Arab youth. And I saw the hopelessness in those Arab countries. And I saw those young men without any future, without any expectations from the life. And when the British embassy showed them a couple of dollars to be a soldier as Mujahid in Afghanistan against Russia, they all flowed there. The atmosphere I felt during the Arab Spring days was real. I mean, I thought what was happening was real. But later, imagine Arab countries from Yemen to Libya to Egypt, Tunis, including Turkey. The rate of sending letters through the postal service are the lowest in those countries in the world. We don't communicate with each other as much as, say, an Italian does. And then, 10 years ago, the rate of penetration of computers to the people's lives was very low. I mean, in those countries, in Arab countries, including Turkey, the people with access to a computer, to an IP-based communication network was very low. Yet, this spring, this revolution, organized on internet. They call it, if you all remember, they call it the Facebook revolution. And there, and look at the numbers Facebook had then were the lowest in the world. It was lower than Iceland, in Tunis, in Egypt. How could those people, my Arab brothers and sisters, could get organized on internet using Facebook and other instant messaging systems and manage to run a revolution to topple the strong men in the power? How could they organize this? I mean, the more it developed, the more we went into the details of these Arab revolutions, and we start seeing one strong man toppling after another. And the question, like many others in my mind, was who actually really organized this thing? And who spring? What was the spring in it? Who was winding that spring, and it was exploding all over the place? I mean, look at Syria, look at Jordan. The most repressive system or regimes in the Arabic world was in this father and son Syrian rulers. I mean, also Jordan was not a model democracy or something, and nothing happened there. And after the spring thing happened, the more I look into the stories coming from individual countries, the more suspicions I do get in my mind as to the who organized this, and who actually paved the way for this revolution thing. We have good revolutions like French Revolution. We have successful revolutions like the Russian Revolution or Chinese and everything. And they replaced the system with something that the people after the revolution would not contradict. Look what happened in Libya. I mean, I don't think any one person in Libya would agree about today's situation. Nobody is happy today in Libya or in Yemen or even Tunis. I mean, after this poor street vendor sacrificed himself and started this huge revolution, quote unquote, died in vain, I think, because nothing changed in Tunis. Yes, the strong man changed. Yes, there is some sort of democracy, but what kind of representative system does it have? It's brought. And Syria, Syria has paid the highest price when it comes to this Arab revolution, and I really shouldn't say more when we have Lina here, because she's going to tell us actually what happened there. I mean, they paid the price. 1 million people died, 500,000 people wounded, and 6 million people fled the country. And what happened? What kind of revolution, what kind of spring did it bring? Nothing, actually. You look at Egypt. Yes, they say they toppled a strong man, Hosni Mubarak. Yes, we had this little bracket of democracy in the country, but look at the country today and see what is happening there. I mean, anybody in the Arab city, in Cairo, participating in those squares for this Arab Spring thing, could not say anything good about the revolution. Anyway, all in all, what I am trying to say is this. What happened is happened. We still don't know what happened. We still have questions like who started this, who organized this, who paid for the organization. These questions are still up in the air. And recently I checked how many Google resources I could find on the internet about this Arab Spring thing. It is close to the French Revolution. Number of books written on this thing and number of articles published on the Arab Spring is as very close to the resources available on the internet about French Revolution. But the questions are still up in the air. Those books are not answering. Hiba Hocam, forgive me if I am going overboard and saying very wrong things, but we still have questions about the true essence of this Arab Spring. We don't know anything about the organization, how it came into being. I mean, again, Egypt, the very first day, they stopped internet. They cut off internet. Nobody was able to go to organize a revolution on Facebook or anything because Facebook was not available. But still, people in Egypt, in Cairo, in many other big towns, were able to get together and organize demonstrations and even riots. Then your explanation of the whole thing as youth expressing its anger, and they got organized through the internet thing because it was an internet-based revolution or anything, still needs explanation, still needs more proof. And truly, as a journalist, I am not still convinced that there was a spontaneous people movement 10 years ago. Then why it stopped? All of a sudden, we still have some strong men all over the Arabic and Muslim world, and people are not springing into any action anymore. What happened? I mean, it was something that took place for 2 years and it's gone. Now we are back to our normal selves or something. I don't know. All I know is there are questions about the Arab Spring, and you, my young colleagues, you need to work hard to answer those questions, because if we don't have answers to those questions, what happened 10 years ago? Why and what happened 10 years ago? We will continue living in this limbo situation. It is neither democracy nor dictatorship or nothing. I mean, I'm not blaming anybody. I'm not blaming neither Arabs or Turks or anybody accepting the system imposed historically on them. There are conditions and there are rules and there are dynamics of every society. But all of a sudden, almost 10 countries had the same movement who cannot organize a simple export and import business among those countries. I mean, people would get together in Tunis and start exporting something to Egypt that easily, let alone a revolution. Hey, we need explanations, and you young guys, my dear colleagues at the Ibn Khaldun and other universities, you should start studying these issues, and the old people like myself, you will gladly read them. Talha Hocam, that's all I have to say now, but as you say, I can answer questions if anybody is not satisfied. The main premise is that there are questions. If somebody says that no, all those questions are answered, I would like to hear them.
Thank you, Hakkı Hocam. We have lots of questions, but before starting our Q&A section, we will take some more reflections from other panelists. But what is really interesting in your presentation is that there are more questions than answers within this 10 years, and people are still exploring, writing, and reflecting on this. So I don't know whether it's a good sign or bad sign, but people's minds are still confused on these issues. I mean, we, the academics, also, what we have, I mean, I go back to my own writings. What I have written 10 years ago, 5 years ago is quite different than what I'm reflecting today. So I think it's quite normal, but I think this, it is also connected to this limbo, political limbo situation, which I think will continue for a while. So that's the interest. So this story is still ongoing and it's still interesting. That's why, Hakkı Hocam, some of these questions are still there. Thank you. So we're going to come back to you. So our second speaker is Hiba Rauf. So Hiba Hoca has her own experiences, her own reflections and philosophical reflections on the issue. So I think I will leave the floor to Hiba Hocam. I mean, she's from Egypt, and I think in that sense, she also experienced the entire process firsthand. It is a great pleasure to have her as a professor for the last 5 or 6 years, but I think that experience is also very rich. So, Hiba Hocam, the floor is yours, please.
So I'm unmuted now. So thank you very much for the introduction. It's really my pleasure to be on the panel with the distinguished speakers and also with everyone who is sharing with us and participating. It's very interesting that 10 years have passed. It just seems as if it was tomorrow. So I was giving a class recently and I was showing the two images, the image of the square when it was very multifaceted and people were around it, and the pictures taking like zoom from above, from different buildings, and sometimes even from drone cameras. And at the same time, the day that after the day that Mubarak stepped down was outset, and we had the first Jum'ah afterwards, and it was a big Jum'ah. The khutbah was by Sheikh Qaradawi, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi. And his discourse actually was given so much attention. And I was reading Andrew Marsh's book on the Caliphate of Man, talking about not the Caliphate as an institution, but rather the notion of the Caliphate of Man in Islam, how the individual and the human beings themselves are very much empowered in that sense. And he was talking about this khutbah as a turning point, because he saw that there was a discourse on, "O Egyptians, come together, O Egyptians, you deserve dignity," and that it was basically fostering this notion of popular sovereignty in a way. And then the picture itself that you find online on the Jum'ah of the 18th of February 2011 shows people on the square, the same square, but in rows, in the rows of prayer. And of course, there were other Christians around as well attending, because it was not seen as a regular Jum'ah, but a celebration somehow of the revolution and its success. And Jum'ahs used to be like every Jum'ah prayer is a sort of a demonstration in the making, because people come out of the mosques and there is a multitude that can qualify for a demonstration, etc. And it was very interesting how people were so enthusiastic. Unfortunately, afterwards, those who shared the same dream and the notion that this is a revolution of the people, an uprising of the different horizons of ideas and backgrounds of people started splitting along the ideological lines, and also started this sort of there were disagreements that basically shaped the following 2 years and reached a degree of radicalization and polarization after 2 years and a half. There are so many lessons that can be drawn. Of course, we moved from the Arab Spring to the Arab winter, if we can say so, because many counter-revolutions took place, and the spring was not really did not last for long. But at the same time, there are so many lessons to be learned. Looking at it from afar after 10 years, it does not mean that I am remote from what is going on in my country at the moment, but there is a distance that can allow actually academic analysis and reflection, which is important for academics. I always thought that. Professor Talha mentioned I had different roles. All my roles were basically as a citizen. So I was not part and parcel of a political party or an ideological group or organization, but I was a citizen, and I just happened to be in a very peculiar position because I live on Tahrir Square. So I did not go to the revolution. The revolution basically came to my doorstep. So yeah, I was active as a citizen before that, starting from the beginning of the millennium, participating in demonstrations that were very sort of curbed by the regime at the time. And then 2005, 2006, we had the movement of the judges calling for more rights, and we supported that. And then we had the Kifaya movement. I was not part of the movement, but I used to attend the demonstrations, sometimes even take my students and my children. So I was an active citizen in a way, but I happened to be in different positions after the Arab Spring. I was part of an advisory group to the Constitutional Committee, an elected one of 100, and we were like 10 advisors in a way. Nobody actually took our advice, so we resigned at the end because it was all run by political calculations, and we were like somehow independent, mostly academics and public figures, etc. Though we were promised that we will be given the opportunity to sort of reflect our sort of concerns regarding some articles here and there. And we already were working on 59 amendments to the constitution document that we received, but this was not the case. When we finished our work, we were told there is no time for you. And after spending almost 6 weeks of hard work, we were completely disregarded, and the political powers represented in the original Constitutional Committee basically won the game, and we resigned. But it was a very interesting experience to see the dynamics of drafting a constitution without the most important constitutional law professors in the country that were in the advisory committee, not in the committee, the main committee itself. It was also interesting to see the backstage of some of the negotiations regarding the constitution of 2012. And I voted no for the constitution, of course, because I was not very happy about it. But I also saw the polarization of political groups and how we started actually on the square trying to come together. And before that, I mean, the Arab Spring is a culmination of a lot of struggles, not only struggles of demonstrators, but struggles of labor movements, struggles of different intellectual endeavors, struggles of student movements. So it was a culmination. It was not about Tahrir Square on the 25th of January. It was about what happened since the 90s and maybe I can say even since the 80s. And the continuation of an agreement and the consensus on some issues like social justice, being against the normalization with Israel, and rejecting the consequences that can come out of the peace treaty with Israel. Many of the political groups and the activists on the ground were against it. Until today, there is quite a resistance on the Egyptian scene regarding that, even if normalization is going very speedy now on different levels by different countries like the Emirates and recently Morocco, and in between Sudan was also approached, etc. So I think there are so many lessons to be learned, and I will pick on what Haki Hoja mentioned regarding the importance of war in his own memories and his own sort of being acquainted with the situation in the Arab world, because actually there is a dimension of war. We teach our students at the political science department that politics has got a component of war as well, because the state is always keeping this right to the state of exception that can basically deprive the individuals from their basic rights under this claim that the country is at risk, etc. And of course, there was that dimension in the Arab Spring as well. The counter-revolutions basically highlighted the fact that things are getting out of hand, we are falling into chaos, and And the media and the propaganda that was conducted by the military elites and also by the counter-revolution forces were very strong. And I will come to that point later, but I think there is always that sort of threat that is usually used to make people fearful of the future regarding falling into a civil war. So when you are conducting political dissent that can reach the peak of an uprising and even a revolution, you have to be aware that people don't have the patience for this to last for very long. There will always be some force coming and saying we need to establish order. This order has taken too long. The country is falling into chaos, and of course a big media machine has been deployed basically to achieve that goal. We should also remember that there is no hope lost. Though the Arab uprising has faced difficulties in most of the countries where it started, so in Syria, and Lina would be talking about that, in the case of Egypt as well, and in the case of other countries, we had a second wave that was interestingly so much overlooked in the Western media. We had the second wave in the last 2 years in Iraq. We had it in Algeria, we had it in Sudan, and it actually substantially changed the systems. In the case of Algeria, a new president was elected. In the case of Sudan, unfortunately, a coup took place as well, but now they are struggling with re-establishing the system. In the case of Lebanon, it led to some changes with a lot of limitations. In the case of Iraq, it resulted in a lot of negotiations with the system. So the question would be, why was this overlooked? Why nobody is talking about that, or not in the media as it was? I mean, if you compare the coverage, it's covered as something going on in Iraq, something going on in Sudan, but it's not like, doesn't have the same coverage as Egypt and Tunisia had the media coverage internationally and globally. And I think that part and parcel of that is that there were so many forces on the international and global level that did not like the fact that Arabs are having an Arab Spring. And of course, there are many conditions related to the assumed threat that if Islamists take over power, then Israel is at risk, etc. And then we can look back now after 7, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years, depending on the sequence of event. Where are you starting from? 2010, 11, or are you starting from 2013 with the changes taking place in Egypt and having an impact, and then the beginning of Libyan war, etc. But definitely this is not something that the international neocolonialism would like to see, and it would be really good to resort to some of the neo-Marxist post-colonial discourse. It's there are still struggles on the international level that we sometimes ignore when we focus on the regional, and this is why when I teach Middle East politics, I always zoom in and then I zoom out to show. And we have to have the confidence to say that we actually sometimes play a very important role in the Middle East, and we do change the maps of the rules of the game. Because why there was no attention given, and why, for example, when you study the Iranian Revolution, regardless of its being, in a Shia majority country, this is not our concern. When it comes to political analysis, we have more factors to look into. But why it was ignored, that it actually affected very much what happened afterwards in Europe and on the global level between the two blocks after the Cold War. I mean, why do we undermine what we do to that extent that we think that what we do is basically only regional? It's actually changing the map, and it has its own impact on the map of the world. And I will also come to that again in a moment. I think that what some of the lessons that we have to learn, I put them in points so that I don't want to take too much time because there are other speakers. But the first thing that any historical change, socio-political and economic change and cultural, is basically a culmination of lot of struggles. And we have to remember that things did not start 2011, 2010, 11, Tunisia and Egypt, but actually this is a culmination of lot of struggles. And every individual, every single person who put an effort to make this Arab Spring happen actually deserves respect. And many of those who made it possible are anonymous. It was not the leaders that took over the opportunity and seized the moment in order to come to the forefront and win quickly some of the quick wins again. these are not the ones necessarily that actually invested too much effort. We have the martyrs, we have those who struggle in prisons, we have those who demonstrated, who made the different strikes. We have different professional groups that actually were part and parcel of dissent across the years. So this is one important thing. Don't undermine an effort that you're doing that actually might have an impact after 10, 20 years. And this is where hope and revolution and hope come together. The second thing is that after any political change, there comes the conflict and the disagreement between the different comrades of the change. And we witnessed that, unfortunately. And I personally lost so many friends. This is my personal negative experience, unfortunately, because people split and ideas are so different. So, and you are accused of either wanting to have more power, so you are competing and criticizing because you want to have a share of the tart, or you are accused of not knowing enough because you are not into the seats of power, so you are just theorizing, or that you whatever you are not into that game, so you better stay silent. So what we found also that in order for the different groups and different parties to form a front and a proper alliance that would take the revolution of the masses, of the majority of people who went to the street, and turn it into agenda for real change, there has to be a public philosophy. You cannot assume goodwill. You have to agree on a public philosophy. And unfortunately, the experience of drafting a new constitution in Egypt actually could have been a very good opportunity. I think that the Tunisians gave it much more time, though some of the secular forces now are throwing this out of the window and acting in a less mature way. But actually, the Tunisians give time to the constitutional, to the new constitution, and it was worthwhile because they reached that notion of public philosophy and understanding, etc. And I think that the constitutions are not just laws. The constitution basically should reflect this public spirit. And I remember that while many people, 2011-12, of my colleagues in Cairo University and intellectuals from different backgrounds were talking about democracy, most of the talks I give, and some of them are on YouTube, I think, or covered on the media and still are on the online. Most of them are talking about a change in the system. We have to think about the republic philosophy that Egypt now is looking forward to build, and the constitution would reflect it, not vice versa. So I think that this also was a lesson that that people have to have a vision and to agree, and it doesn't have to be thick. It can be thin. That people agree on the thin level of a public philosophy, but at least see the communalities, etc. Another lesson is reimagining the civil-military relations. We could not understand and see that actually the army on one hand and the armed forces were looking at the squares and at the streets as war zones. They were acting accordingly. I mean, we had many instances that took place after 2011 till 2013, and then afterwards, when it came to the opposition and to the demonstrations on the street, etc., they were not considered basically opposition. There was not a matter of tolerance or intolerance regarding going to the street and demonstrating. They were basically managing the public space as a war space, as a zone, as a war zone. And this has many indicators, and it was not seen at the time between 2011 till 2013 in the Egyptian case. We were just seeing that the army has to go back to its original role, that there is a high use of violence, that some people assumed that the forced disappearance was by taking people from the streets and from different places was done by the intelligence or by the military intelligence, and there was a struggle in terms of human rights. But there was no conception in the civil sphere that actually it's run from the other side as a war. And I think this would have made a lot of difference to focus very much on the tools of power that the masses have on the street and how the different political groups could actually orchestrate this to maximize the benefit of the social uprising and political uprising by the masses on the street. Those who don't have a name, don't have a face, do not show up on the YouTube or in the programs, TV programs, satellite programs, they were the ones who were basically could have been the force of negotiating with the military, and this was not done. Most of the political parties basically started negotiating and then looking at those on the streets as thugs, basically, and that order has to be maintained, etc. And then eventually, behind closed doors, of course, the military is more stronger than most of the social movements and groups once they come out of the street. So I think that the management was very inappropriate to the situation. Another dimension is that sometimes this is portrayed and then the counter-revolution as an Islamic secular sort of cultural war. And I think this is very unfair because not all Islamists are terrorists, as portrayed mostly in the media and sometimes even in the official discourses. But also, it's not about secularism and Islamism. It's also about freedom. It's about dignity. It's about the struggles of people. It's about achieving a minimum quality of life for everyone in the country. So I think putting it in terms of the Islamists are a threat, secularism is the escape and is the sort of the saving cultural frame for the future. I don't think that this is promoted, by the way, by those who are in power to make these splits, to divide and rule. Another point is the urban space. I think that we have neglected very much urban sociology, and this is one of the topics I teach at Ibn Khaldun and at MEDIT as well, at the Institute of Alliance of Civilizations, because I think that the spatial dimension of revolutions was very much also overlooked. It's not only about political discourses, it's not about struggles, it's not about action, it's not about negotiations, it's not about political democracy in terms of elections, etc., and then coups, etc. But it's also about managing spaces. It's managing the urban space. And I think that urban sociology would have helped us a lot to understand and unpack some of the events that took place. And I think that all political discourses, we somehow in 2010-11, we were still captured by the political discourses of the ideologies of the 20th century, even if we were in the 21st century. So there were fights between the Marxists, the Nasserists, the Islamists, the Salafis, the Ikhwan, you know, and these are inherited from the 20th century. The 21st century needed actually the culmination of practical and pragmatic and real factors actually took place at the backdrops of those ideologies, while actually we needed a vision for the future that is matching the challenges that the Arab world and the Middle East is facing in a changing global map. And I think that this was missed, and this is one of the things that actually led to that. There is also another thing, that activism on the street and boots on the ground and activism on the street is not enough. The media plays a very important role, and many people and many studies highlighted that Facebook and Twitter played a very important role in the mobilization and in the coverage of news and in documentation, etc. But political regimes also went into that realm of the virtual space and started making regulations and laws to curb this type of activism. And hence, technology plays a role. People have to resist not only on the ground, but also resist by developing applications and programs and techniques in order to overcome these obstacles, sometimes even barring specific websites that provide information from being seen online in specific countries and some sources of news. So there has to be also some technical struggles as well in order to be able to keep a safe space where people can have access to knowledge, have access to data, have access to information that is not tarnished by a specific ideology or perspective. I will finish by stating two things. The first thing that you must have read 2 days ago, Trump granted pardon to Blackwater agents who were convicted of killing civilians in Iraq. And the Arab Spring was about democracy. And if the country that is claiming to be the biggest liberal democratic country in the world is granting pardon to mercenaries that have basically killed civilians, what type of global democracy or democracy on the global level can we actually promote to our people? What type of messages is the United States basically sending? And I think that also him calling the current president of Egypt as Sisi in one of the meetings, where is my favorite dictator, is also a humiliation actually of the political elite that is very sad. I mean, even if these are the ones who are taking over power in our countries, but the humiliation still, is felt, to this extent. The people and even the elites that have alliances with the superpowers are so much humiliated by these powers. So I think that the future of democracy should be a concern of even our academic work, with the rise of populism, with the rise of radical movements and right-wing movements in the world, in many countries that keep winning seats in the elections in Europe at least, is actually a concern. Rising Hindu fundamentalism and the distortion of a very inspiring experience of Indian democracy that used to be taught in our departments as an example of democracy in the third world, with the rise of clashes between radical Hindus and Muslims, and interestingly with the alliance on the political level between Israel and India, a lot of very warm diplomatic relations taking place. So again, the Arab Spring is not separated from the globe. And these signals need to be seen as requesting and necessitating a more in-depth understanding of the dynamics of power struggles and how they should be situated not only on the national or the regional, but also on the global map. And I still have hope. I see how young people, though they are in different places, especially we have different students in our university coming from different countries. We have students from Libya, Yemen, Egypt, Syria, Iraq, you name it, Morocco, Sudan. And I think that that even if we are now in a moment of exodus, in a moment of sort of distortion and a moment of this displacement, etc., but it also carries a lot of potential. It carries a lot of potential for people to change, for new generations to be able to reform the ideas and challenge actually the tactics of the previous generations and try to figure out how to make change possible in their respective countries and societies for a better future. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to say hello to all my very inspiring and promising students at Ibn Khaldun, and hope that they would take over the struggles in their own way. And I think that sometimes for our generation, it's necessary to take a step back and allow these new generations to basically think about the future in their own way and take the struggle forward for a better world, not only for a better country or for a better region. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hiba Hocam. It was really inspiring speech. So we are really proud and hopeful about younger generations. So we have an opportunity to socialize with them, have spent some time, and it's a great pleasure. So they definitely have a different mindset than ourselves, which is good. But I think that's the inspiring part. So interestingly, we often talk about international dynamics, regional security issues, and sometimes the power dynamics, but Hiba Hoca reflected on the civil society and especially the management of the urban space, which is often omitted dimension of this Arab Spring. So for that, I think I'm also thankful to you. So our third speaker, last but not the least, Lina Shami. So as a young woman, she experienced both, hopes, disappointments, and new beginnings of this revolution. So starting from her own experience from Syria, I think this story is still, of course, very new to her. I mean, her experiences are very important. But I think one key dynamics is the dynamics of the youth. So you spend some of your, time as a young woman there. And I think especially the researchers who reflect on Arab politics, Arab society, reflects the significant dimension of the youth. So your own personal experiences, as well as the from the perspectives of the youth, I think your reflections will make important contributions. So the floor is yours, Lina.
Thank you, Professor Talha. I hope my contribution will count after Professor Haki and Professor Hiba. It is really my pleasure to be here in this panel with amazing professors. First of all, let's agree that it is impossible to compress 1 decade in few minutes, especially about Syria. And it was hard actually to, when I was thinking how to pick my words to talk about Syria after 10 years of Arab Spring, because Syria is one of the most tragic situations among the Arab Spring countries. Death toll estimated more than 500,000, according to what has been documented so far. It is beyond than this number. Nearly 250,000 are detainees in Assad prisons, tens of thousands deaths under torture. More than half of the Syrian population were forcibly displaced inside and outside Syria as refugees. We thought when the Arab Spring started that what happened in the 80s in Syria, the massacres of Aleppo and the massacre of Hama, it can never be repeated again, because now we have media, now we have journalism that will document what is happening. However, documenting and filming everything and contributing the world with what happening in Syria was not enough. But at some points, I think media helped in not making the situation worse, especially in some points, in some critical moments, like in Aleppo siege. With all the worst thing that happened, more bad thing will happen if media was not there. If the attention of the world was not with Syria at those critical moments. Now, back to the beginnings. Syria, of course, was touched by the domino effect of the Arab Spring. And despite there was a sensed unity, or let's say an ethos of the Arab Spring, one ethos, you will find the Syria flag in Egypt. Egyptians will chant for Syria or for Libya. In Syria, they will chant for Libya. So it was crazy. But soon after 2011, the different situations and the different countries started to contrast and take different trajectories. And people in Syria sensed the peculiarity of the situation in Syria, because we were in front of different natures of the regime and in front of different map of interests. The interest of international power in Libya differed from their interest in Egypt or in Syria, for instance. They were all dictatorships, yes, and I know living under dictatorship is bad anyway, but the peculiarity of Assad regime, it was beyond than that. It took the shape of cult, forcing the population to worship the leader. The very little margins of freedom that were absent, that were there in Egypt or in Tunisia, were totally absent in Syria. The structure of the regimes differed. The army in Egypt differed from the army in Syria, which was so loyal to the Assad personality himself. It was the impossible revolution, because all the chats that we had while we were watching what was happening in Tunisia or Egypt, we were saying, no, it's impossible that Syria is going to witness such a thing. And yet this impossible thing happened. We were thinking like that because no one could imagine or guess how the scene will be. It is because Syrians know that violence is not only a mean that the regime will use violence is in the essence of this regime. It is one of its pillars. So even in times of what appeared to be stability, Syrians were living in fear and in terror from an unexpected knock on the door at night. Anyone can disappear for unthinkable reasons. Before the revolution, no one could dare to talk about it. You just go and pretend that life is good. But the situation was like that. Fear was everywhere. In Syria, we used to say that walls have ears. It was since Hafiz Assad took power, restructured the army, which became more sectarian and more loyal to Hafiz himself, the regime started to shift to a personality cult, or forcing the people to this shape of cult, which the regime then was represented in Hafiz himself. Regime was the state and the state was the regime. There's no difference. Syria since that time had a surname. It was Syria al-Assad. So Big Brother is watching you all the time, everywhere. You have years of oppression, brutality. Assad prisons were known and famous of its brutality since Hafez era. Corruption, denial, execution. So Syrians had all the reasons for the revolution. However, the spark need to come, and the opportunity was sensed from Tunisia and Egypt, and the spark was from Daraa, the famous story. There's no time to address it here. But when the revolution started, it felt as if history suddenly, and for the first time, started to be written by Syrians themselves. The momentum of the surreal moments of the first protest overwhelmed any attempt to analyze what was going on. The choices of the regime to deal with this peaceful revolution at the beginning, and also some regional and international dynamics, led to the situation Syria is in right now. And here I want to comment on one thing that usually I read in literature or in analytical paper, those who refer to the situation that is happening now in Syria as civil war. And I don't think that this is scientifically right, because civil war, this concept has much more local or domestic dimensions, while what we are seeing now has much more regional dimensions than local ones. And that's why using this term only adds more layers of vagueness and does not help us to understand what was happening in Syria. So moving forward, what started as peaceful demonstrations was faced with unprecedented suppression and violence by the regime. Despite the brutality, the peaceful protests continued for a noticeable time before shifting into an armed revolution. And this direction was imposed by Assad regime, and also due to signs sensed from the outside atmosphere. The Syrian people realized that they were alone. They realized that they are on their own, facing the brutality of Assad regime. And also Iran and Russia, who supported the regime from the beginning. Iran was there from the beginning, even though they only announced their official existence in Syria in 2013. And Russia also supported the regime from the beginning in the UN Security Council. They vetoed every resolution that aimed to protect the Syrian people. So at the beginning, there were hopes that the international community would do something, especially after a no-fly zone was decided in Libya. It gave hope to the Syrian people that maybe such intervention can happen. And however, the brutal massacres were met with only silence. And it appeared as if the UN Security Council regarding Syria was administered by Russia. Many resolutions that aimed to protect the Syrian people were vetoed for the favor of Assad. And we found that despite raising mottos of freedom, democracy, human rights by Western countries, especially the US, which has much influence. It appeared that after the Arab Spring, that they preferred to deal with authoritarian regimes and keep a blind eye on issues of freedoms, human rights, for the favor of stability in the region. However, in the case of Syria, stability was far from being achieved under the rule of Assad. So this silence created a vacuum of power in the region, and it was filled mainly by Iran and Russia. And with all their activities maintained undeterred in the region. Of course, without the support of Iran and Russia, the regime would not have stunned this long. Obama administration was the worst regarding Syria after the famous, the very well-known chemical attack in eastern Ghouta near Damascus. And despite the loud warnings by Obama, he did nothing. And this served as a green light for Assad and his allies to commit more massacres without any consequences. Also, the deal with Iran served as a green light for Iran to expand freely in the region. So the situation maybe differed a little bit in Trump administration with applying the maximum pressure policy on Iran. But however, the US generally did not seem serious about curbing Iran expansion across Syria, as long as it is not threatening Israel. And this mission to remind Iranians about their limits in Syria was carried by Israel, which carried many strikes on Iranian locations in Syria. The last one was only a few days ago. So it doesn't seem that the maximum pressure policy will continue under Biden's year. It seems like we are going to have much more of Obama's policy in defense, doing nothing in the region. Finally, I want to say that Assad from the beginning raised the motto, Assad or we burn the country. He also sought to market itself in the international community, even before the revolution, as the key of stability. In the beginning of the revolution, he understood and mastered the dynamics and the trend of war against terrorism and marketed itself this way, either me or the terrorism, as if he is not the source of terror in Syria. And all sorts of terror and brutality, he used to fix this equation. He thought that by lashing this violence at this pace, Syria will go back stable under his rule. But it is because this violence, it is because this unprecedented brutality, Syrians now have more reasons, more than at the beginning of the revolution, to reject the rule of Assad. Assad and Russia and Iran did everything to regain control on large areas of Syria, but they failed at all levels to achieve stability. The economic situation is disastrous. Security situation is disastrous. Refugees are unlikely to return. The regime's nature is unchangeable. Arbitrary arrests continues. Detainees still missing. Idlib also. Idlib still have a mysterious future. Stability is far from being achieved. So that's it, long story short.
Thank you, Lina. I mean, your side of the story, unfortunately, is a little bit depressing. So hopefully, you know, we cannot even say that the worst is over, but I mean, definitely we and the region learned a lot from this experience. So I think we will continue to reflect on it. So, you know, after the first round of our initial, you know, interventions, I would like to raise a couple of you know, couple of questions to our speakers. So I will start from Hakkı Hocam. So he's an expert on communication, and he has probably experienced, has reflected on many revolutions, failed revolutions, uprisings in the past. So lots of people make some parallels between these color revolutions in the post-Soviet, geographies with Arab Spring. So what is your reflection on it? I mean, are there some parallels, or is this completely new thing? I mean, are there, overlapping and cross-cutting issues with these color revolutions and Arab uprising, or maybe 1989 revolutions? So some people also made some similar parallels between. So what is your, take on this?
Hocam, you are right, and Hiba Hoca even went one step further to compare Arab Spring to the general idea of popular uprisings, sociologically speaking. I mean, you have labor struggles, you have gender, you have economic and similar struggles, and at one point they culminate in one Tahrir Square, and the people topple the government. I mean, it happened in Paris, it happened in Moscow, it happened China, it happened everywhere. However, the colored revolutions you mentioned are happening without any preceding work on the part of people. I mean, look at those countries in the European, Eastern European, and then Caucasian republics, post-Soviet people states. Now, the issue here is that they are perfectly well governments. They are perfectly working economies, post-Soviet economies. Yes, they had been experiencing all the bad things happening to the Soviet Union. They were in the same boat, and they were sharing Soviet problems. However, they had perfectly working government operations there. I mean, there were jobs, there were education, schools, universities, conservatories, and no Ukrainian youth could complain about anything compared to any Egyptian young man or woman at the same position. Because in Egypt, in Tunis, they didn't have jobs. They didn't have social security. They didn't have any equality with the other social economic classes or anything. I mean, they had all the required conditions of a popular revolution. But when it comes to Ukraine or other post-Soviet countries, the problem they express were not authentic. They were imported problems. They simply came out to declare, to demand freedom of expression. They had perfectly good working newspapers, many channels, and they had opportunity to go to on any television channel that night and express whatever opinion they had. It was not suppressed. It was not anything. I mean, yes, they couldn't say anything against the new Russia or the boss Russia, the former motherland Russia kind of thing. Other than that, there was no any social pressure felt in the society. All those colored revolutions were imported revolutions. They were not authentic. Even though I kept raising questions about suspicions about, and at one point I even mentioned some conspiracy theories about the Arab Spring. Yet, as Hiba Hoca said, conditions other than these conspiracy theories, they had authentic reasons for a popular uprising, for a revolution, for demanding change in the government, demanding change in the regime. But they were not organized to do that. somehow some people get together at Tahrir Square, and they were able to topple this dictatorship, which was erected in the first place by the United States. I mean, how easy it was to topple that kind of government there, but not do anything in Ukraine. I mean, half of their countries are being occupied by Russia. Look at Georgia. I mean, even right now, it's happening in other countries, in those colored republics, colored revolution countries. In brief, that's what I am going to say. Colored revolutions were as artificial as possible. They were injected by some powers to be from outside to those countries. And the reason for this popular uprising was to destabilize the regime and its relationship with the former Soviet Union or New Russia. But in Arab Spring, the uprising was authentic, however, yet not organized enough to go to anywhere in that country. Still, in those colored revolutions, the artificial revolutions worked somehow, but the authentic revolution in Arab countries didn't. This still brings my mind many questions. I mean, why it happened, who organized that, who was the power behind those colored revolutions? If you consider Gezi events in Turkey in 2016, it was some sort of colored revolution, and it was, God forbid, was about to succeed at one point, but thanks to Erdogan's strong stance against those, they didn't go anywhere. I don't know. I mean, still those questions are, as you raise them, needs answers.
Thank you, Hakkı Hocam. So I will raise a question to Hiba Hocam. So, I mean, one critical issue that really bothers me is that why political elites who experienced the revolution were so disconnected from the people. I mean, we see, I'm talking about the post-revolution, and I'm also talking about post-counter-revolution. I mean, it is very difficult to understand. I mean, we see the situation in Libya, Yemen, Egypt. I mean, why those elites and why revolutionaries were so disconnected with the people? And another question that's raised by Etemos, which is, I mean, in the aftermath of these revolutions and these, movements, it was very costly and it was very violent. So do you think this will discourage any further uprising or request for political change in the region?
I think that we have to zoom in a bit to see what was going on, but also what is going on today. So I think that just a little comment on Hakkı Hoca. I don't think that it was only the firm stance of Erdogan, the president, but also the people who went to the street. They were the real sort of counter force, and there were so many people killed, and there is this memoriam in Üsküdar. So it's how people react to defend their own freedom, and this matters a lot. And this actually is part of the answer to what Talha Köse is saying, which is people have to defend their own freedom, and they have to defend their own rights. And there has to be grassroots leaderships, and there has to be a sense of engagement and ownership of the public space. When the different groups and different organizations and different civil society, even actors in terms of NGOs, associations, etc., make people feel that they are representing them, and you stay away from that, you're just a lay citizen, you're just a lay person, and we know better. There is that sense of we know politics better, or we are more expert in dealing with the elite better than you. People will not feel that they will go out of their homes to face, you know, the tanks and the fractions from the army that were doing the coup in the case of Turkey 2016, and pay a price for that, and feeling that they have to pay the price to defend democracy they worked very hard for many decades. So I think this is also part of it, that the elites present themselves as talking in the name of the people, and the people have to be silent. And it is that balance. The people who were on Tahrir Square did not have anyone to talk in their name. So the most of the forces that came out of Tahrir Square were basically already organized before, and the small group of youth that were taken as the youth of the revolution had no experience. And they were basically, they are now, most of them, regretting that they got into the matter without having enough experience and vision, and that they at one point managed to or we're willing to basically negotiate with some groups in society, including the armed forces, while they had no previous knowledge about how to do this in the proper way. So I think the lesson for the future, because of that, is that number one, over ideologization, the putting more stress on ideology and discourses, etc., instead of actually being the voice of the people, reflecting what they need, supporting every action that is actually demanding dignity and freedom and a good quality of life, regardless whether it's by peasants, by workers, by professionals, you know, having this wide sort of scene of never undermining a small action of resistance, a small action of demanding full citizenship in a way, is something very important. The second thing is, I think that it's impossible, if you want to achieve change, to avoid a degree of pushing back. I will not use the word violence, and I will not use the word force, because it would be translated immediately as terrorist, you know. So it's like, but you cannot face tanks that are shooting at you. You cannot face massacres with simple slogans. You have to find a way to mobilize the power within the system and mobilize the power within the social system to basically stand against it and push back. Pushback can take place in everyday resistance, everyday life resistance, can take place through formulating ideas, condemning acts of excessive violence by the state, up to taking some of those who are responsible for such actions of violence through very professional legal tools to the international level to face the international criminal court. You know, you don't have to turn into a secret organization or something. There are so many ways that you can actually voice the dissent of people and act in different ways. And actually, this is what led to 2011. I mean, we had, since the beginning of the millennium, different small groupings, including the group and the movement of Khalid Said, that were on Facebook and then called people to come down in very peaceful way to stand in the streets and just, you know, show resistance without even speaking for some years before the revolution, and then called for the 25th of January. And nobody, by the way, expected it to happen this way. You know, no one expected that the 25th of January would turn into an uprising. People thought that everyone who went there said, I thought that I would go and all these jerks, my friend, will not show up, and eventually I will just, you know, leave and go meet them on the cafe and shout at them. You know, nobody expected it to culminate to the clashes on the 25th of January, and then to continue on and off in a sporadic way for 3 days, and then on the Jum'ah, the 28th, turn into an uprising that basically eventually changed the regime. So it's I think it's very complicated. Every analysis that I read about the Arab Spring takes an angle. You also have to know different groups did not know how to deal with the urban space itself, how to actually see the points of power in some urban areas, in some dense neighborhoods, for example, and avoid passports that are basically class-wise. You know, I mean, nobody had them the 28th of January demonstrating in a very peaceful manner and then faced by the tanks. We stopped. We don't know how to handle that. We are the middle class, so we stopped there and started, you know, chanting and singing and then raising flags, and they were throwing gas bombs at us. And those who made the difference were the people who were coming from the less privileged areas you know, from the back of from our backs. They passed us, and then they started engaging with the tanks, climbing the tanks and being ready, you know, to engage. And then the tanks turned around and just, you know, and there are so many videos and on YouTube that you can actually watch how the action, the sporadic and spontaneous action of those who are less privileged, who can't know how to engage in such situations without violence, but engage in a way, change the whole scene, basically. So I think that that we have to know, as yani, the political movement have to know how to basically orchestrate change and how to bring together on the map of change different forces and different groups and rural and urban alliances, etc., in order eventually to reach a point. And this point cannot be set by date. You know, it happens, it culminates, and then it takes place. So I think that the role of ideologies, as I mentioned, according to the 20th century map, should change. And people should actually put forward a public philosophy and a public discourse that would bring people together and unite them in a where
Hibabjan, I have another question to you. So on the one hand, you know, when we look at the entire situation, on the one hand, I'm really happy that there wasn't a civil war like in the case of Syria, Yemen, and Libya in Egypt. So you know there wasn't a comparable bloodshed. But on the other hand, there was this, you know, hopes of the Egyptian people, especially the youth, vanished, and the country is moving to another direction. So the question is coming from Mahmoud al-Muallim. I mean, there is this paradox of, you know, dignity and, you know, life. So what is the situation? I mean, is this the fate? I mean, this the paradox, or is it this situation that is portrayed by you know, those regimes? So on the one hand, it is good to avoid the bloodshed, but on the other hand, this, you know, dignity, honor, and freedom are important. So what is your take on this? I mean, of course, compared to the other failed, you know, revolutions, some people may find Egyptian situation better, but some people may disagree on this. So what is your take on this?
You need to define what is a civil war. So, and this question was addressed by Agamben, you know, in his work, Stasis. You know, he was talking about the civil war and saying that it's very difficult to define. We have a lot of theories about revolutions since the beginning of the 20th century and even before. And we have clear literature and a lot of literature on war, you know, but we don't have anything that has to do with civil war. Very little definition. International law or revolutions or social movements, but not civil war. And he said that it's very fishy. It's very it's a very ambivalent notion. So to which point do you have to wait till you declare that this is a civil war? And I think sometimes we have to look at it again as a matrix. So we have civil wars that are cultural. And this is why I wanted to say that it's not about an Islamic secular polarization only. There are other things. Of course, there is a degree of cultural disagreement between the secular and the Islamist regimes, but also secular and secular groups as well are different. Some of them are liberal and some of them are leftist, Nasserist, you know, so you can not put all of the Islamists in one bag and the others in one baggage, and then say this is the polarization that we are witnessing. There is also the class dimension that has been neglected as if classes disappeared. You know, all the talk is about ideology, but actually we have an issue regarding class. The last official statistics published by the government last year is that almost 33% are under, in Egypt, in the case of Egypt, are under the line of poverty. And it's increasing. So it witnessed a jump somehow. So if you have this figure, it's not enough to look at the situation and say we don't have the war that is taking place in Syria. I mean, there is something here that is causing a lot of tensions, and the government more and more is lifting subsidies regarding different essential commodities that used to be supported by the system before. So, and raising some taxes as well. So you will reach a point where there is this fragmentation and this conflict and tension in the system. I hope that that Egypt would not run into that, but also you have here and there clashes between lay people and the system that are not covered as part and parcel of a potential, doesn't have to be civil war, people killing each other, but I mean, there is a degree of tension that eventually, unfortunately, might erupt at one point. And this is not actually wished by anyone. So, recently the government made fines regarding building without permission. And this is, of course, people used to build, like they take the permission of building for 3 stores and then they build 5. And then when the government comes, the Baladia, etc., they pay a fine. This was the case, as long as the building can take the layers built over it. But then the government decided that it will bring down any violation of the permission for building. And it started doing it in some urban areas, but also started doing it in the rural areas. So you imagine these poor peasants or the average peasant family building another additional store, thinking that they don't need to take any permission of anyone. This is my home, this is my land, and I will just, add a flat on top of it to marry my son or my daughter in it, etc. And the government comes with bulldozers in villages to bring it down because you didn't take a permission. Of course, people went out and there were demonstrations actually in villages, not covered by the media, and they were massive to the extent that the government had to change the regulation that it announced and started giving people more time and accepting fine instead of bulldozering what they built. So this is, for example, a silent revolution that took place in the last 6 months. And the number of people who went out and rejected that and stood in front of the bulldozers is huge. But it went unnoticed because we are waiting for another Tahrir Square. And I think this is a mistake. Tahrir Square will not take place again. It will not happen this way. And you have to understand the urban-rural relations and the notion of the public sphere and the public space and the different segments in the society in order to anticipate where the movements will come from and then how they will culminate and basically exercise more pressure on the regime. Hopefully, no one wishes for a civil war in Egypt. Hopefully, driving the regime to basically change its policies and respond to people. And if it started now by the very direct right of me to build a small flat on my roof, for my children, how can it then, through different framing of the rights and dignity, move to a wider space instead of just, pushing back when things reach my doorsteps only, because this will not make a wider social change unless it's taken by those who are politicians and working in social movements and active in the public sphere, basically, to turn it into a wider call for respect, consultation, proper democracy, etc. We had elections a few weeks ago, and some very prominent figures were declared winning according to the counting system, and then eventually the committee that declares the results declared them failing, so they were not elected, and there was that gap between what was declared and what people witnessed in the voting centers. And just yesterday or the day before yesterday, one of those figures who was a previous parliament member, an independent one in the previous parliament, even if it is under a system that is basically ruled by but at the end of the day, you have to analyze politically, actually became the successor of Hamdin Sabbahi, the head of the #1 Nasserist party in Egypt. So Hizbul Karama now elected Ahmed Tantawi, this young man, to become the new leader, an independent ex-parliament member in the last 4 years. So this is a small change that might not indicate anything. And some people might say, oh, how many are those Nasserists anyway? This small party does not really matter. But it's actually through such different small attempts to challenge and to change the discourse and to in the different political groups to give the more power to the newer generations. We respected that very much. I mean, if this can be repeated in other groups and organizations and political parties and political movements, it would be great, handing the flag to the new generation, and maybe some things would come out of that. I'm not exaggerating about the importance of such an action. I'm just giving it as an example. So I think that redefining the political and redefining uprisings and redefining public dissent and how we should see it and where we should spot it and how these can be taken as points and then the nodal points to be connected and eventually can make change is the mission of those who want to see change occurring without falling into a cycle of violence. You are muted, Talha Hoja.
So I will also have another question to Lina. Lina, we know that unfortunately, or these protesters or revolutionaries were not well organized, and that costed a lot of life, and also it turned into a difficult situation. So first of all, I mean, what did the revolutionaries, protesters learn from entire this experience? And secondly, are the younger generations optimistic? I mean, how will they reflect on this experience? So what is your take on this issue?
Well, I can speak about the case of Syria. I don't know if it's the same for all the Arab Spring countries. The revolution actually, we cannot say it was a choice, and many of the developments, we cannot say that they were a choice. It was there was no any body that was organizing, the revolution and deciding that the revolution would happen on this day. It was unexpected. It was irresistible even by those who participated in it. Or this is at least what I experienced. We were not, let's say, we did not have the privilege to organize. We could not have the chance to have this luxury to organize ourselves in groups at the beginning. Before the revolution, no one dared to talk anything political in Syria. But I believe, of course, when we look back at the years before, of course, we realized that there were many things could have been done in a different way. However, this awareness we would not have it unless we had this revolution. We would not have the political experience. We would not have the experience in social movements or protesting or challenging the discourse or the system unless we had this revolution at the beginning. So it happened, and it strikes, I believe, as a necessity. Because there was no any chance to express for the people to express themselves anyway, so it had to burst at some point into a revolution. And now, because of the revolution, we have the awareness that will help us to assess, to do assessment to what happened before.
Hakkı Hocam, so we have lots of questions, but I don't want to take it longer because this online panels may be difficult in terms of communications. But last but not least question. I mean, we have experienced different set of revolutions in the past. I mean, agrarian revolutions, industrial revolutions, and some may argue that this is, this cycle of events may be considered as the first in post-industrial or communication, age revolutions. So first of all, I mean, do you agree on this, or how revolutions or political, uprisings and maybe protests will be different in the future under this emerging communication revolution?
Hocam, you are right. I mean, the more into the communication age we go, the easier the small riots will burst into big revolutions. It is going to happen, we see it. However, as Hiba Hoca a second ago mentioned, there is this huge thing going on in small villages in Egypt, and it is happening against this very powerful person, Trump's favorite dictator and everything. He has whole Egyptian army behind him, Air Force and everything, and corporations, and the United States fiscal empire is behind him. But still, he has to lose certain small wars to peasants, to villagers who are trying to build a second unlicensed floor on their building, simply because U.S. or Western press is not behind them. We don't have CNN reporters following them. If they had, this small revolution in that village, in that Egyptian small town, would be suppressed ruthlessly by the dictator, because everybody, whole West, would be looking into the situation, and they would simply take care of it. But now, as contrary to those things, CNNs and everything, we have our own revolution. We have Twitters, we have Instagrams, we have now TikToks, and we are sharing information without any proportion. I mean, you do something in that small Egyptian village, next day we will hear it here in Istanbul, because somebody will share it on Instagram, and we will know, and we will start supporting their protests. Therefore, from this point on, suppressing those revolutions will be very difficult, but starting them will be very easy. I think next, this young men's and women's generation will see how easy it is to topple the dictators.
Thank you very much, Hocam. So, I mean, we can continue to discuss this issue, this process. I mean, I think we will come and raise lots of other, discussions. We have some questions, but I think it's better to keep it, at this, at this time. So, of course, we couldn't touch some of the key issues such as, Yemen, Libya, Tunisia, or as Hibaujan mentioned, Sudan and Iraq. Of course, there is a lot to reflect on this. But I think overall, from all these assessments, we can, come to some, outcome that this is definitely an unfinished process. So the change already started, accelerated. It has been suppressed, and some counter-revolutionary forces played important roles in the last couple of years, but their power also have some limits, I think. So at some point, those counter-revolutionary power and forces will also give up at some point, and we will end up in a different political situation in this region and other. I think this, what we have been experiencing in the last, 10 years, it started as a spring, turned into, winter, but still hopes with regard to change are, blossoming. I think that's the key thing. So although they killed probably the revolution, but not the hopes. I think that's the key thing. I think that gives some stimulus for change. So we will continue to discuss from different perspectives, but today's interventions, today's discussions were, I think, very interesting. So all our presenters give from different perspectives. I really like Hakkı Hocam from the communication perspective and this comparison with the other revolutions. Hiba Hocam mentioned about the social dimension, the urban situation, and also the changing nature of this protest. And Lina also reflected on her own experience, and also, the Syrian situation. I think there is a lot to still contemplate on that. So I would like to thank all our panelists as well as the people who raised questions. So unfortunately, I couldn't take all the questions, but I don't, this is just not the period, but it's just a comma. So we are hoping to continue these discussions, even continue to discuss with the younger people as well, with our students as well. Their reflections are also important. So we just try to provide some medium, and I would like to thank all who stimulated this discussion. So thank you.
Thank you, Talha.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the technical support of the university as well.
Thank you. See you.
See you, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.